Hello and welcome back to the Article 18 podcast. This is Steve G. Jones. I'm the news director here at Article 18, and I'm delighted to be joined again today by our director, Mansour Borji, and also by Iranian-Armenian journalist Fred Petrossian. So great to have you with us again. Mansour Jan, I wondered whether we could first of all talk a little bit about Nowruz. It's the season currently. I know obviously there's a lot going on in Iran, so it's probably not front of people's minds at the moment, both in Iran and even outside of Iran for those thinking about it. But it's a huge event for Iranians, hugely significant today. When we're recording this, it's Seizdar Bedar. Maybe you can just introduce that concept to people, explain why I referred to you as Jan, which might be a strange name for people not familiar with Iran. So maybe you can just talk to that a little bit, please.
Yes, thank you, and greetings to all who are joining us to listen to this podcast. It's amazing that every year almost these two occasions, the Christian celebration of Easter and Nowruz, or the Iranian New Year, or I don't know, what would you call it? It's not just Iranian, many other people groups in that region celebrated, from Afghanistan to Tajikistan, and Kurds in different parts of Middle East also celebrated. So it's a pre-Christian celebration of a new year that continues to be celebrated despite many change of directions in the region in terms of faith, different orientations. And for many Christians also, this is a dual cause for celebration, so both Easter and Nowruz, which comes really close in terms of timing. So although I think Fred would agree or correct me if necessary, but many Armenian and Assyrian Christians in Iran do not really traditionally celebrate Nowruz as such. Some may do, but perhaps because it's rooted in a pre-Christian Persian culture. But for converts, it's a different story. Often they don't see a strong sense of conflict with their Christian beliefs, as this is seen as a more national celebration. And in fact, many of them will celebrate it, and while also trying to import some Christian meaning to it. For example, on the Hafsin table, where items like Shahnameh or the poetry of Hafiz might traditionally be placed, some Christian converts choose instead to include the Bible. So rather than rejecting Nowruz, they often reinterpret it, seeing themselves as a renewal of hope and new life, deeply compatible, of course, with Easter and the message of Christian celebration of Easter, the resurrection of Jesus Christ.
Okay, yeah, thank you. And you've mentioned there, so Nowruz, which literally means new day, Haftzin, which means 7 S's, although you've got a few S's. How many S's are in the Persian alphabet? 3? Is that right? 2, 3?
Yeah, 2 or 3, but
2 or 3?
the Haftzin is supposed to be all symbols of each of these items that are placed at the table are symbolic of one thing, wishing for greater prosperity or health and all kinds of things in the new
But
year.
they all begin with one particular scene, I guess, right? The letter scene.
Yes, although it's debatable. I shouldn't upset those who celebrate Hafshin, which
right,
I think so it's a debatable concept. I don't want to get into that controversy, but it's either Hafsin or Hafshin.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't even know that. See, there's lots of things that you find out about Iran, which takes time to understand, including the concept of Jan. So for those who don't understand that, it's a term of endearment, which basically just means dear. So we refer to each other as name, dear, but dear is Jan every time. So it's quite confusing for those of us who know Jan as an English name. But there we are. Well, sticking on the concept of Persian. Fred, Jan, I wonder whether you can please tell us a little bit about the Persian podcast that's just started a week or two back, what you discussed. I know that the concept of war came up, obviously, with what's happening at the moment. So please just tell us a little bit about that podcast, please.
I think it was more or less the same thing that we did in English previous time, the first podcast of Article 18. And we talk about of course, the war concept and Christian concepts and visions, doctrines about war, that, as we explain in our English concept, is divided onto two major categories of pacifists, which can go from absolute pacifist to non-violence resistance, and to just war, or people who believe that wars is evil, but is less evil than other evils that a country or a nation can face, from just war to preemptive war, and how some people change their ideas because of the situation, like Reinhold Niebuhr, the great theologian in 20th century, who was a pacifist, but after rising to power of Hitler and Nazis, became getting that sometimes war is less evil than some power and dictatorship that we face, and he came with Christian realism and so on. But one point that I think is very important, that I think we should always emphasize on that Christians should look at each other as members of a community and think about a lot of common things that they have. And because their theology about war or their vision about war is different from each other, or their political, belief, they shouldn't, start to label each other or thinking that they are less Christian than they are, and so on. Because the Islamic Republic, for example, when they send you to jail or deprive you from your rights, they don't think if you are Catholic or Protestant, or you think about pacifism or just war. You are a Christian, and it's just enough for them considering you as a threat and kick you out. And you should think about that as members of community when you look
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, and for those interested, on our website, we've got a few articles which talk about this in more depth. A couple written by Fred and Mansour, originally published on Religion Unplugged. We'll come back to that a bit later. But also there's one which references the comments made by a British Iranian Anglican bishop called Guli Francis Degani, whose story is incredible and speaks to the persecution of Christians over the last 47 years, because her brother Bahram was murdered, I think at the age of 24, if I'm not mistaken, in 1980, so just a year after the revolution. And it was one of several deaths, at least 10 Christians killed since the Islamic Republic was founded. So you can look at her reaction to the war and how that differs from others. You can read all of that on our website, so I'd encourage you to do that. That's article18.com, the word, not the number. And Mansour, I wonder if you can just fill us in a little bit now about the current situation in Iran. Particularly, we're aware of prisoners at this time, so a lot of our work outside of wartime focuses on the detention of Christians for their faith and imprisonment. And I know that before the conflict started, we had 48 Christians at least that we know of inside prisons in Iran. So please, can you just speak to that and the few reports we have heard of what's happening in Iran as the internet shutdown continues?
Yes, of course, it's very very troubling. I think many people read on the news the general stories of war, but the situation of political prisoners, particularly in Iran today, especially places like Evin prison in Tehran, has reached an extremely alarming level. That several human rights groups have sounded this alarm and written about the conditions there. I think people remember that there was an airstrike by Israel on the 12-day war, which happened last year around June, July. And the prison itself sustained some damages, and explosion caused some injuries to some of the inmates, including some of those Christian prisoners. But perhaps even more concerning is the apparent collapse of the prison management that has been reported. There are credible reports, including from our own contacts, that the guards and administrative staff of the prison have left their posts, leaving prisoners with minimal supervision and care, particularly in the political wards, where it's reported that the doors are locked and minimal oversight and care. And so that has kind of triggered some humanitarian crisis inside prison. The food distribution is being talked about and reportedly has been stopped or stripped down to bare minimum. Access to clean water is severely limited, and also the prison shop where people used to, or prisoners used to, buy the groceries or anything that they actually needed to survive beside the bare minimum food that is offered in prison. That's been closed. Prisoners are facing a very real prospect of starvation and serious health crisis as well. Some of them, of course, are in need of medical attention and medication, which now it's a question whether they can have access to those. So all of those is portraying a very dark reality of for many political prisoners. We issued a statement, of course, as Article 18, echoing that concerns that we continue to hear from prisoners and their families, and of course many prisoners in other prisons across the country face a similar situation, but perhaps less reported.
Thank you. Yeah, and Fred, I know that you helped to write that statement for us, one of your many skills, and so I just wonder if you can talk a little bit to that about the imperative to protect civilians in times of warfare.
I think it's a very important issue at any war that happens, that civilians and especially prisoners, because they are the most vulnerable, and that they are trapped in a kind of iron cage by the state, which doesn't really care about their health and security, even during peacetime. And we have several conventions and in international law that mention several terms, but human rights organizations in Iran and Iranian ones or outside Iran, non-Iranian ones like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and even United Nations, that not only civilians but the civilian infrastructure like schools and buildings or electricity should be protected. And we have a Geneva Convention in 1949, a couple of years after World War II. It's clearly mentioned that the protection of civilians during war must be guaranteed and must be respected by all parts. Saying this, I should add that when there are dual effect or dual usage of facilities like schools using as a military base, the immunity gets disappeared, but still there are restrictions on how that building should be attacked. There are some details about only the military, at least in theory, only the military part should be attacked, or sometimes in the case of hospitals, it should be warned if it's possible, and so on. But when you use these facilities as a military base or for military users, that immunity at least partially get disappeared, and it makes that building or civilian infrastructure as a target of military attacks. Is one point. Second point is about recruiting teenagers as old as 12-year-old as basijis for checking point. Human Rights Watch in an article really detailed how this action violates international law at different levels. Employing kids even at checkpoint is a kind of direct violation of not only human rights, but several international laws and treaties that Iranian state is engaged to do that. Saying that about protection of civilians, I should say several leading scholars like Michael Walzer, who wrote Just and Unjust Wars, and who is a great philosopher of political thoughts and thinking, mentioned Bible and Deuteronomy code as probably the first ancient text that talks about indirectly about protection of civilians, as it mentioned in the war. You shouldn't cut the trees that bear fruits for people, saying you shouldn't cut the food or water or different things that civilians use to survive. It's the first first text for many scholars that make a great leap towards protection of civilians, that several of international treaties and international law got inspired by that.
Thank you. You touched on a lot there, and I'm sure that those listening to this will have heard about the bombing of the school that happened in the early days of the war. There's a lot of coverage of that. Perhaps they won't have heard about some of the schools being used as military bases and the complexity that adds to this situation, and also the Basijis you mentioned, which is a paramilitary force allied to the IRGC, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, that many people will be familiar with. But they are the two sort of main instruments of repression, aren't they, inside Iran? And yes, children as young as 12 being recruited. So clearly this adds the complexity on the ground and such a difficult situation in terms of the war. Mansour, we've reported a little bit about a couple of cases. Information's been so scarce with the internet shutdown, but I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about some individual cases reported, just to give a little insight for those not familiar with those cases about some human stories that we're aware of at this time.
Yeah, I think it's worth mentioning Simin, for instance. Simin is a Christian who was arrested a while back, actually in 2020, if I'm not mistaken. She's just actually celebrated her 48th birthday in Evin prison. But then when she was arrested and detained shortly before being released on bail, she was charged with, of course, the typical national security related charges, basically for her Christian activities, which it's not that as strange as it sounds. It means basically worshiping together with other fellow converts to Christianity in a home called house church, and that's because they're not allowed to use usual church buildings that the Iranian government in their propaganda war usually portrayed as symbols of religious tolerance, and how there are many churches in Iran operating, but they're actually, these Christian converts are banned from entering any of those. So the alternative they have is to meet in secret in their homes, which has consequences of arrest and detention and long imprisonment. Imagine just something that we take for granted, just walking on the street and you find a church, you say, may I just go in and light the candle or pray, or maybe I attend the worship service. That has dire consequences for you if you're in Iran, and especially if you're a convert. And therefore, when you're not allowed to go to these buildings, you resort to whatever is possible, and that whatever is house churches. And so she received ultimately a 10-year prison sentence, while she had actually used that temporary leave to flee the country via Turkey to eventually settle in Canada. But years passed, and some of the fellow Christians that were convicted at the same trial by a notorious revolutionary court judge, served their sentences and released. She, of course, was under a lot of pressure. Imagine leaving the country like that and never being able to go back. And then you get the news that your parents are dying, or in this case, Simeon's father passed away after an illness. And then she found out that the mother is terminally ill as well. So she couldn't bear that emotional impact anymore. She risked it all. She returned, and then upon returning to Iran, she was detained and taken to Evin prison to serve that sentence. Of course, she's tried all the legal means to challenge that court decision. Fortunately, that has been reduced to quite a bit. But she was eventually, I think, left with 3.5-year prison sentence still to be served. Just before the war, I think the authorities had agreed to turn that into basically a house arrest with the electronic tag, so you can't leave your home beyond the parameters that is predetermined for you, whether it's 1 kilometer or whatever. You just do some grocery shopping and be back before the evening. But then before that new order communicated, the war started, so she's still in that horrible conditions in Evin prison, as we described earlier. So she's a mother, of course, concerned about her own mother, which she returned to look after during her illness, and now in Evin prison. And that's just one human story among many others. I could go on for the rest of this podcast and more, talk about these heartbreaking stories, but that goes to show how innocent lives of many other prisons of conscience, Baha'is are there, and people of other faith, political activists, journalists, lawyers, and many like them.
Thank you. Yeah, and we reported recently on one such political activist, actually, a Christian convert. It so happens as well. He's a well-known figure in Iran, Mohammed Nikbakht, and so you can read a bit more about his story as well on our website, and how he was violently detained and beaten. So this is just to hopefully give our listeners some insights into the situation of these Christians who are imprisoned, as Mansour said, mostly just for wanting to worship together, read the Bible together, pray together, simple things like that we take for granted here. Now, I wondered whether we could come back to what we was referenced earlier, the Religion Unplugged articles that you both wrote, and particularly Mansour, I know that you wrote a piece looking towards the future. It's a question that lots of people are asking at the moment. What's going to happen after the war? We don't know exactly when that will be, but people are looking forward. So I wondered if you can just explain a little bit about that piece and what your thoughts are.
Well, Steve, you know that the modern institutions, science, academia, even politics, is governed by a sort of sense of cause and effect and predictability. So people ask questions as if you're a fortune teller or a prophet, or you see the futures clearly. But that's not really the case. The world that we live is so complex, and so many things contribute to any meaningful change. So when people ask the question, so what happens if the Iranian regime collapses, either because of the war or the civil unrest, it seems that it's inevitable. This regime has been stripped of all the legitimacy because of crimes they have committed against humanity, against their own population. Just imagine, in 2 days, in just January this year, they killed over 35,000 people, nearly 40,000, huge figures that only can be documented if we were able to do more thorough investigations. Perhaps even more horrible stories emerge if we discover those stories. And among them, of course, there were some Christians which we reported, people who just simply joined the protests to express their grievance against this regime. So with this level of brutality, it seems that future without this Islamic Republic is an inevitable one, whether it's going to be sooner or later. But the question about what alternative then we can see, every political group seems to offer some sort of alternative. So the word alternative is a buzzword that is going around, and some, of course, seem to have more popularity and perhaps popular legitimacy, and others are also trying to build coalitions and groups that offer to especially Western governments as a credible alternatives. And in this article, Iran's Future and the Test of Freedom, I think the central thesis is that Iran has reached this turning point that is not just politically, but also morally. And the question is no longer whether the Iranian government can reform itself, but whether in this inevitable future, Iran can genuinely guarantee human rights, and specifically rights to freedom of religion and belief, which is central and perhaps one of the first victims of the Islamic Republic. So the article argues that decades of repression, especially criminalization of these peaceful activities of religious expressions of Christians and other minority groups, and the tight control of the Iranian government have exposed the limits of the Islamic Republic's model. So I suggested that any meaningful future for Iran must be judged by some clear standards, not just the rhetorics and slogans that is used. Everybody talks about a democratic future, a secular democratic future, but what does that mean? Whether by investigating the speeches or practical examples that are illustrated by these so-called alternatives, we can reach a better conclusion of whether these groups have respect, ultimately committed to these fundamental rights or not. So I've been a bit skeptical about internal changes. Some people talk about, any change that has to come from within, and that usually kind of a reformed Islamic Republic, whether they hope that the new Khamenei or some of the senior IRGC commanders could bring a shift to a more moderate ones. I've been very skeptical given their history and so on, but I've also tried to evaluate or assess other alternatives with a test of freedom, whether Iran, future Iran, in their viewpoints, it can be defined by more controlled ideological enforcement, or whether it can transition to a system rooted in genuine respect for human rights, human dignity, and freedom of conscience. So I invite people to read and offer their point of view and comments.
Yeah, we would really encourage people to read that, and just to name a couple of those alternatives that many people will have probably heard of. You've got Reza Pahlavi, who's mentioned there, who's the crown prince, son of the former Shah, deposed Shah of Iran, who's been quite outspoken actually in terms of religious freedom, including recently in a statement made in Dallas, Texas. So Mansour's article speaks to his statements and what religious freedom might look like under his leadership. And also another group mentioned that many people may have heard of is the MEK or NCRI, which is also known as the Mujahideen, and they are a fringe group, but with quite a bit of popular support, or some popular support among Western leaders, and including some bishops in the past. So really would encourage you to read that piece and see how credible those forms of alternative could be. to consider that for yourselves. I don't know, Fred, if you want to come in there at all to speak to that.
Yeah, just a couple of comments. When someone asked me about Iran's future, Mansour explained it very well. I say, as Forrest Gump said, life is just like a chocolate box, and you don't know what is inside, and you have a lot of surprises. I think Iranian history, and Iran's future in the same line. I give you just two examples. If my memory is good, Fred Holiday, the great Middle East expert who lectured for years in London School of Economics, I had the honor to interview once many years ago. He knew Farsi very well, very, very well. And he wrote a book, I think a few months or 1 year before revolution, and he didn't see the Khomeini rising to power. I mean, and or Michel Foucault, the philosopher who went to Tehran and reporting during revolution, and praised Islamic revolution as a spiritual awakening and so on. He didn't see what's coming on, and he, of course, in court, he apologized and repented when he saw execution and so on. And it's full of unknowns, many unknowns. From Forrest Gump to Michel Foucault and Fred Holiday is how I see the situation.
Okay, thank you, Fred. Yeah, well, as we come towards the end of this discussion, Easter's around the corner as we record this. So for Iranians, as Mansour said, really a special time of the year, the new day, the new year, spring coming, the triumph of light over darkness, and obviously within the Christian faith, it's the sort of thing that we celebrate as well at Easter time, that same concept really. But I obviously, in Iran, for Christians inside Iran, Easter time might look slightly different than it does for many of us over here in the West. A couple of years ago, the BBC wrote an article, again, I'd recommend looking that one up, called "The Christians Celebrating Easter in Secret," and it focuses on the stories of Iranian Christians, particularly converts, and what celebration of Easter looks like. But just for those who might be interested to hear about that, Fred, I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about what Easter looks like for Christians inside Iran.
I think Christians, as Mansour mentioned about Nowruz goes behind, Iranian or just Persian, and if not only people who celebrate that, but people who don't celebrate that. It's still a great event, and not only because their friends celebrate, but it's a kind of resurrection of nature and renewing everything. Easter is the same thing, I think. I just read one Instagram post from a poet and writer Iranian who was jailed for his writings. I translated that. I will read for you. And it's very interesting. It's a point of view an atheist about the Easter. I will read. The days of Easter are beginning for me as an atheist. Easter is a symbol of hope in the midst of hardship. The difficult early days when the Last Supper and Judas' betrayal continue with the torture, crucifixion, and death of Jesus, but ultimately end on a hopeful note with his resurrection and return to life. These days, as the people of Iran are still mourning those killed in January and enduring difficult times under bombardment, war, rising prices, and internet shutdowns, perhaps hope for freedom and better days is only thing that keeps us alive. It's wonderful.
Wow, thanks for sharing that, Fred. Yeah. And yeah, wouldn't it be wonderful if in a future Iran, under whoever's leadership that is, people of all faiths and none can celebrate Easter as they choose. The same with Christmas, can go into a church if they want to, or not. Wouldn't that be wonderful? That's certainly what we're all hoping for. Yeah. Before we close, is there anything else that either of you would like to say?
I think, Steve, just worth mentioning that when it comes to Easter, there's a contrasting image as well, and that is the reality that the Christians from historic communities, primarily Armenian and Assyrians, who are officially recognized religious groups, can celebrate Christmas or Easter holidays in a traditional and more public way, although they have also to face some limitations or restrictions imposed by the state. But nevertheless, they can attend church services, gather with their families, and observe liturgy, and much like Christians elsewhere in the world. But the stories that you referred to, covered by BBC, it's a very different reality and more difficult one. I think I still remember that interview that BBC had with a couple of converts from Iran, and where they described how these celebrations can take place quietly in small gatherings and hidden, and just a very vivid image when they described how in small groups, sometimes even meeting in parks, sometimes in a moving car when they get together, perhaps in a van or just a taxi, in order not to evade the surveillance and risk of arrest and imprisonment. What is really significant in there is that they nevertheless reserve the option to celebrate this very important Christian festivity, and they hold it in however way they can with level of flexibility. Sometimes they describe that we don't celebrate Christmas or Easter on the same day as the rest of the world. We may celebrate it days or weeks earlier or later, just to avoid this surveillance and risk of arrest. But then, nevertheless, it becomes a point of resistance and making a statement how important for them it is to observe these Christian celebrations, despite huge risk and cost that it bears. So, all respect to many Christian brothers and sisters in Iran for holding these celebrations and Christian occasions, and making it, I don't want to say it civil disobedience, but nevertheless it's a point of resistance and standing up for what they believe.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have seen over the years, of course, Christmas and Easter are times when there are more arrests, unfortunately, of Christians just for their faith. Also, what you were saying reminded me, Mansour, of a story of Savada Agasser, who was Assyrian, I think, and so a recognized Christian, but was imprisoned.
Armenian.
Never. What did you say? Sorry.
He was Armenian.
Armenian, sorry, but he was, and he was one of the recognized Christians, therefore able to celebrate these times. And actually, in Iran, Armenians and Assyrians might be given release at times, like Christmas and Easter, from prison, temporary release. And I remember a picture of Savada singing in his church choir during that release from Easter about 5-6 years ago. So it just shows, there are so many strange contrasts within the Islamic Republic, and complexities, nothing straightforward, but we long for it to be so. So thanks once again for joining us here on the Article 18 podcast. I hope in future weeks to be able to introduce you to even more of our colleagues, and some more of the topics that we've covered here for the last 7 years and more working together. And Mansour's been doing this job for even longer. So we'd love to keep introducing you to our work. Please do come back for the next Article 18 podcast.